Hi, I'm George Alger with True Green Energy, and I am interviewing Craig Shields, the author of Renewable Energy, Facts and Fantasies. Welcome, Craig.
Thanks very much, George. Good to be here.
Craig, you speak of externalities in renewable energy. What
Right.
the heck does that mean?
Well, externalities generally are consequences external to a certain phenomenon. So just take an example. As they apply here, you have, for instance, gasoline. So we extract crude, we transport it, we distill it, we transport it some more, we put it in our cars, and we burn it. So that's fine, except for external situations like the fact that it produces carcinogens from which people are dropping dead. Well, that's an unfortunate consequence. Who's paying for the cost of keeping those people, dealing with asthma and lung cancer and other forms of disease? Well, you and I are. Well, what about the oil company? Well, no, they figured out a way that to get around that. Well, that's one of dozens of externalities that are becoming more and more clear and more definable, identifiable in terms of exactly what they are and what are they costing us.
All right, so would another way to define externalities be the financial costs associated with the negative consequences?
Yes, exactly. The externalities, you're right, externalities have financial costs, right?
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so those externalities then are hidden or buried, or they're just generally not as apparent to people
Right.
looking at the cost. Is that the
Precisely.
case of them?
Yes, well, by definition. In other words, they're external to the thing itself. So you think, well, I'm paying $3 a gallon for gasoline and I'm putting it in my car. That's the deal, right? Well, no, it's not the deal. That doesn't include the costs of fighting wars to keep those oil channels open and so forth and so on.
Okay, and perhaps another analogy might be secondhand smoke,
Yes.
related to smoking.
Sure.
Okay, then the costs or the externalities regarding fossil fuels are just one of the factors that we're looking at renewable energy as ameliorating or even getting
Yes.
rid of.
Yes, exactly. And when you think about them, I mean, obviously war is one of them, though that's debated. I mean, you will find the occasional politicians who categorically tell us that we do not fight wars about oil. I'm not sure how many people believe that anymore. But certainly we have the concern of global climate change. We have the concern of peak oil. We have in other words, the fact that the inexpensive oil we've already found, extracted, and burned. Now we're looking for expensive oil. And what are we going to do as a society when oil becomes scarce? Well, guess what happens when you probably recall when oil was scarce a few decades ago. It caused some social chaos. So now all of a sudden people are concerned that I can't get gasoline. That means I probably can't get food. So there are shortages of there's social chaos, even in the United States, which is obviously a very civilized part of the world compared to a lot of other places.
Okay, so in spite of the fact that going in the direction of renewable energy would reduce and perhaps even get rid of these externalities associated with fossil fuels, and in spite of the fact that just having clean energy is better for the environment, better for our children and our grandchildren, there's a lot of factors that are against it. And on your True Green Energy blog, I see you get comments about people have opposing views to renewable energy. Do you find that that's been changing over the years, or it's actually getting more excited? People who would oppose renewable energy are becoming more vocal, or do you find that we're actually on the downward slope of this?
Well, it's an interesting question. I think that I'm not sure that there are people who are against renewable energy. There are people who believe that it's too expensive, and that the difference between a sustainable, what most environmentalists would term a sustainable approach to energy, and what we have now is negligible in importance. In other words, they're global warming deniers, et cetera. So, but I don't think anybody's against renewable energy per se, is what I'm saying. Though, there are people who go, well, all of this, global warming is a hoax. It's made up by the people who want to bilk the taxpayer of the money that we're paying for atmospheric research and so forth and so on. So, I mean, there is that camp, but I don't, is it becoming larger or smaller? I'm not 100% sure. It seems to me that, for instance, when I started this thing, there were people who said, well, all we really need is nuclear energy. You don't find that quite as much anymore, just on the basis that even the proponents of nuclear energy realize how viciously expensive it is. In other words, the cost of going through the permitting process and deploying the construction and operation of a nuclear power plant at this point is just fantastically expensive. So do people want to, I mean, the issue about renewable energy is expensive. It's a bargain compared to nuclear.
And I guess if a person or an industry is even pushing nuclear, that safety factor must be handled for them, or handled in such a way that they feel there's a confidence that there won't be problems again?
I suppose. I don't know that, I even ask people about, well, what about, even if you're not concerned about operational issues like Chernobyl or 3 Mile Island, aren't you concerned about where are you going to store this stuff? What about the Yucca Mountain issue where this thing went away and now all of a sudden we got no place to store nuclear waste? We have to figure out how to keep people away from this stuff for the next half a million years. Doesn't that get your attention? So in my estimation, Obama, and I suppose this was just earlier this year, came out in favor of nuclear as part of our energy portfolio, much to the shock of most of the people who supported him. I say, I don't think it's that big a deal, because by the time you even contemplate building one of these nuclear plants and get it anywhere near the point at which it can be deployed, the cost of photovoltaics and wind, and right behind it a half a dozen other technologies, will have come to the point of what's called grid parity. That is the time at which that it's the same price as an incremental watt of coal or whatever. So nobody's going to be, by the time you could conceive of building one of these nuclear power plants, it's going to be a non-issue.
Okay. Earlier you mentioned that you don't think anyone is really opposed to renewable energy, it's just a cost. So couldn't we view the cost as a factor that will go down as technology increases, and therefore it's almost a foregone conclusion that we will get to a point of more universal use of renewable energy?
Yes, exactly right. It's really just a question of when. And the people who study this in terms of this grid parity issue, exactly when will the cost reduction in, say, photovoltaics make it on a par with the cost of say, coal? People are talking about 2014 plus or minus, between 2014 and 2018. So the question really is this happening? Yes. When? Nobody knows exactly. I think the real question is who's going to make a buck in the process. The energy industry is so large and so driven by big money and big power that the only real question is how can energy companies and everybody else concerned with this thing, whether it's private entrepreneurs who play a role in this, maybe they're installing solar panels or converting electric vehicles or whatever. What is the trajectory by which people can make a buck at this? And that's an understandable concern living in a capitalist system. Everybody's concerned about that, and trust me, it's not lost on big energy. So that's the most of the tough realities sink down into that exact issue. In other words, not are we going there, because obviously we are. The question is when, and how are we going to make a buck in the process?
All right, and then what, or maybe a mix of which renewable energy technologies will perhaps come to the forefront?
Yes, and that's a very interesting subject as well, because as I'm sure you're aware, there are at least a dozen flavors of this. And when you break down the sub-flavors, you're into many dozens. So for instance, you've got hydrokinetics, and you've got biomass, and you've got geothermal and wind and various forms of solar. So it's a very interesting story to talk to somebody who's all about, for instance, geothermal, and which has enormous potential, but right now it's a little bit risky. It's like what digging for oil was in the the 1930s. You have dry holes, and instead of digging through sand, you're digging through the toughest rock in the Earth's crust. So you've got, even with the technology, you can imagine what those drill bits look like in the year 2011 compared to what they looked like, oil exploration of the early part of the 20th century. Even now, it's a horrifically risky endeavor. So, but they're making incredible progress, and that's an enormous, certainly in individual parts of the United States and elsewhere in the world. It's a fantastically exciting technology.
So do you have any confidence about which technologies will be at the forefront or show the most promise?
I don't have confidence, but I do have ideas, and I've got my own opinions. You can't help but, you go on the road and you conduct 25 interviews like this, you can't help but walk away without some opinions. First of all, I went into this subject believing that there would be one or two winners. I left believing the exact opposite. I do see merit and reason to support a great number of different technologies within this for a couple of reasons. Number one, we need liquid fuels because we drive cars and trucks. So the concept of electric transportation, whether it's battery-based or fuel cell-based, needs to be contemplated in the overall energy picture. Almost 40% of the energy that we use in the United States is in transportation. So you can't have an energy solution that doesn't contemplate how to move this stuff around, and thus locally stored, hunks of energy, whether it's a gallon of gasoline or a 30 kilowatt hour battery. So you've got that. Now that militates toward biofuels. So algae in particular. It turns out little is good. So these little algae capture and store 30 to 50 times more energy per liter than any terrestrial plant. So, thus the imperative to come up with, well, what exact organism are you going to use and how is this going to be processed? Fantastically important subject. Having said that, for instance, utility scale energy, you've got concentrating solar power, solar thermal. My particular favorite, if you're going to do this at a utility scale, but I'm constantly reminded that not everybody's doing that or at all interested in doing this at a utility scale. That it was the paradigm of the 20th century, and it's the way big energy companies got big, but it's not necessarily the path of the future. They refer to solar as the people's energy. So in other words, this doesn't have to be a corporate-owned, gigawatt utility scale anything. Most of the energy 50 years hence could very well come from individual homes, apartment buildings, condo complexes, office buildings, etc., with this stuff on the roof. So in other words, distributed as opposed to centralized.
All right, so we're just about out of time here, but in a very short summation, so which technology do you see have the most promise?
Well, overall, I really like solar thermal. Because maybe it's because I can't think very well with this whole thing of distributed energy. In other words, when I look at solving a problem for 7 billion people, I look at scale. I look at how do you build this stuff at the least cost per megawatt, right? And for my money, that's probably going to come in the form of solar thermal, simply because the process it uses extremely common, inexpensive materials. It uses land that most people don't care too much about, the environmental impact on which is minimal. And it uses energy storage technologies like molten salt in other words, the sun doesn't shine 24 hours a day, so putting baseload power onto the grid 24 hours a day requires energy storage. Well, this uses, because it is itself heat energy, you store it as heat. You don't store it as electricity, which is fantastically expensive. So storing energy as heat, using it, converting it to electricity on an as-needed basis is, I think, the mainstay of where energy generation is going to be in 50 years.
Thank you, Craig. We're out of time. We've been speaking with Craig Shields, author of Renewable Energy, Facts and Fantasies.
Thanks so much.